2020. As businesses, most of us tend to be, the default option tends to be a preoccupation with today and the immediate tomorrow. What are we doing to hit our numbers? Are we meeting our targets, etc.? And that sort of, very sort of focus on the day-to-day really is what makes a lot of businesses, retail in particular, actually very exciting, dynamic environments. But we always encourage every business actually to take some time out to think about where the world is going in 2020, 2025, because although it might seem, in the far distance, actually a number of retailers are beginning to realize that the future happens far sooner than you ever anticipated. And particularly if you are in the entertainment or electronics category, it's definitely happened faster than you expected. So just as a sort of, to urge that sort of action amongst all of you, sort of just a few high-level thoughts on Retail 2020 and our perspectives on where it's all headed and actually what that might mean for the high street. So by comparison to a lot of other industries, if you look at the sort of core interiors of a store, for instance, you might argue that actually, retail has not really been an industry of rapid change. If you compare that with mobile phones, for instance, and if you watch Gordon Gekko in his earlier movies and sort of the big handset that he gets when he sort of leaves prison, that's the mobile phone industry, and a lot of other industries have probably seen much more fundamental shift than the retail environment. And it's clearly easy to get, carried away when you're predicting the future in terms of how we might be shopping and sort of leading our everyday lives. But one thing that has happened that's absolutely transformative is channel migration. Now, I'm not sure these numbers quite match up with yours, James, but that's absolutely fine. Our perspective, and I think it's quite important to also look at it not just in retail as a total, but actually the breakdown by category is really quite important, because by 2020, I think we're almost seeing sort of three tracks or three tiers of categories. There's the likes of electronics, electricals, and media, where absolutely online will by far be, will overtake store-based sales, and in media it's already happened. So we think there's a sort of fast track here around categories that are in the sort of broad electronics, electricals, and media space. There is a somewhat slow track if you're food and grocery, DIY, home and furniture. Now that's not insignificant, so those changes are not insignificant, getting to something like 10–15%. And just sort of for context, a 1% switch from offline to online roughly sort of translates into a 1.25% LFL impact for the industry. So actually, a 1.25 LFL decline is quite substantial depending on which industry you're in. So at the slower end will be food and grocery, DIY, home and furniture, and something like clothing and furniture we expect to be somewhere in the middle, at around 30%. And whichever way you slice and dice it, I think there are two messages. This channel migration is absolutely transformative, and it will play out differently depending on what category you're in as well. And we're also starting to see a polarization, and in the sort of 2000s and early 2000s to 2012, we've talked a lot about polarization and the whole sort of Primani effect and Primark versus Selfridges and people sort of trading up and trading down. And we've talked about that polarization by price. We think that's actually going to shift from being price-based polarization to polarization by emotional engagement. And at the one end of the spectrum, you're going to have categories where consumers actually enjoy the buying process, desire emotional engagement, and it could be in a range of things. It could be from luxury goods, but it could also be to the enjoyment consumers get from purchasing fresh cuts of meat through to fresh produce, etc. So we think there's going to be at the one end categories where consumers enjoy the purchase process and are going to fundamentally engage much more with the buying process. And right at the other end, commodity products, where you can almost imagine where it's just about low hassle. You could almost put it on auto-replenish, and as long as your core essentials are replenished by a sort of online retailer, you're absolutely fine. And it's really about convenience and price that you're seeking to maximize. And we think that polarization by emotional engagement is going to result in some sort of fundamental shifts in terms of the models or the shopping models that we will see in the landscape. And we broadly sort of look at it, as consultants, we're prone to think sometimes in 2 dimensions. It simplifies life. And we think actually there's going to sort of really break out in terms of categories and the importance of trial. And where you've got categories where consumers, again, enjoy the purchase process, where trial is of importance, and I sort of think about furniture, for instance, or indeed clothing to some extent, and then the extent of the purchase decision. And is this something that you really need to consider, research before you buy, or is it something that's actually quite small ticket and something that you could sort of go out and purchase on impulse? And so we think the world is therefore fragmenting into models such as, on the one hand, experience-based destinations. This could be department stores, for instance, and which is why, 10 years ago, everybody sort of knocked department stores and predicted that department stores would have no future. In fact, it's one of the formats that's massively sort of innovated itself, and a number of department stores are thriving, notwithstanding the growth of the internet. And this is really because they're playing around, being experience-based destinations, particularly in the categories that they participate in, where experience and trial are really important elements of the purchase process. And so that, again, whether that's health and beauty, clothing, homewares, etc., and sort of bringing all that together in terms of experience and fit. And it's quite interesting, some recent research we've done with teenagers sort of almost comes out. So although their lives have always been digital, when you ask them what's the thing they enjoy doing for fun, shopping is top of the list. So it's almost a counterpoint to a group of consumers who's just so used to digital being part of their world that going out in the physical environment is sort of almost a treat and a special experience. So we think experience-based destinations are going to exist, and they're going to coexist with, at the other end, convenience destinations. So whether it's a Tesco Express or whether it's a whole load of convenience formats being rolled out by a number of the grocers, where actually it's really about low hassle and ease of purchase, and just making it really simple and easy to access, and that's kind of what the proposition is. And the 2 elements, or the 2 sort of models that we expect to see, some substantial growth is in the whole sort of online and click and collect arena, where clearly there will be a lot of growth. The other interesting sub-segment is around sort of the niche of automated kiosks and how, as technology gets more advanced, what that enables. So, a number of people are trialing, could you take prescriptions, for instance, and do those to kiosks? So actually you don't have the cost base of, pharmacists in store, but you could sort of do it at the back end, and could you have kiosks that dispense your prescriptions, and a whole lot of other, convenience or impulse purchases. So we think those are certainly the 2 segments that are going to be bigger, but they will coexist with convenience and with experience-based destinations as well. And clearly the big change really is the connected consumer, and so whether that's people using smartphones as part of the purchase process. So nearly 75% of consumers who own a smartphone will absolutely walk around department stores and grocery stores kind of with the smartphone as almost a research tool. And it kind of opens up a really interesting conundrum for retailers, when sometimes consumers come into their stores almost better informed than the sales colleagues. And that opens up a really interesting training challenge as well in the retail environment. And again, in the same vein to some of the numbers that sort of James showed, I mean, we've done a lot of research across a number of countries. This is an example, in the French market across a number of categories. Actually, the true proportion of virtual shoppers, i.e. customers who are researching and purchasing online, while it's increasing, is still quite low in some categories, as you look at DIY beauty, footwear, sports, etc. Much higher in categories like consumer electronics. But then the number we think is quite staggering is the proportion that are researching online but purchasing in store. The digital researcher. And across all the categories, you're looking at absolutely the majority of consumers are researching online, purchasing in store. And so, regardless of what your model is and whether you're an experience-based destination or a convenience format or a click and collect format, you have to really think about, the role of online as part of the decision-making process. This is some data from the UK, and this shows, consumers are actually choose their own trajectory, and they're really quite relaxed. There's, around 49% that do everything from browse to price comparison to buying in store, but, the majority are actually choosing and picking their own channel and whatever is more convenient for them in order to browse or, compare prices and, where they end up buying online. And, that sort of opens up a very different lens on how you look at your, e-commerce operation, because there's a role it plays clearly in driving sales, but there's also a role it plays in informing and enabling browsing and price comparison and research overall. That's quite fundamental to the model. And the next finding we have is actually around click and collect and just how, broad the appeal of click and collect is. And at some extent, we were wondering, a lot of people have hypotheses that is click and collect just for busy mums. Actually, it's not. Because, the numbers there suggest while there are some spikes in certain age groups, fundamentally that profile would lead us to conclude that almost regardless of age group and income, there is a reasonable propensity for click and collect. And we think that's quite sort of interesting that almost regardless of who you are, you've got to sort of have a lens on how does, the click and collect model and what that, how you configure it for the customer and what that might do for your economics as well. Now this is sort of really, I think, for us actually the nub of it in terms of, what this all means, for the value chain and, which parts of the value chain are really going to, gain in importance or reduce in importance. And if you looked at the 70s was really around, the era of the manufacturers, where, Unilever's, P&G's, Cadbury's, Nestle, the manufacturers sort of really was where, all of the power of the action was effectively, and you had, some production, you had wholesalers and retailers, but really it was the manufacturer where a lot of the innovation, thinking, and sort of value creation was taking place. In the sort of 2010 kind of, and then sort of last 20, 30 years, that power shifted to the retailer because they had direct customer access. And you found that, a combination of direct customer access and own label range development really sort of led to a lot of power shifting to the retailer base, and the manufacturers sort of, have had to respond to that. We think 2020 actually opens up a bit of grey area for retail. We'll come to that, but I think it sees two new sort of interesting trends. One is the emergence of, the digital advisor, the Google, the Facebooks of the world, etc. And, we think that's going to be a sort of important area stream where a lot of innovation and value gets created. We think the upstream process, so which is the owners of design, IP, and brands, actually a lot of value is going to be created there as well. And then the interesting thing will be their interaction with retail, because a lot of brand and IP owners will also want to go direct and become retailers. And you see that in, Apple, I guess, epitomizes it to the best extent. Apple is as much as an IP and brand owner as it is a retailer today. And the reason is sort of quite simple, because if you could get direct to the consumer, you have not just customer access, but your ability to capture value is absolutely far greater. So we will see a lot of evolution in terms of who's occupying that retailer space, and a lot of brand owners will want to become retailers and get better at it in time. So we think actually there's a lot of interesting evolution to come in 2020. A lot of the world is also going to be open source, we think, as we've seen a lot of open source platforms that are absolutely sort of taking off. And we suspect actually that the future of retail is going to be much more around open source and customer led. And if you sort of move from an era of in the 70s to 2000, it was all about large scale category killer superstores. We think the period we're now in is much more about the retailer as a brand, the retailer actually building true customer relationships. So although retailers have had direct access to customers for a long time, I think there's sort of the ability to actually build those direct relationships is sort of really taking off now, the importance of customer insight. And we think 2020s is really going to be about much more open source, customer-led retail models. What does that really mean for the high street? I'm going to skip over a few slides, but it's fair to say that the high street has really been under pressure for a while. And whether you sort of look at vacancy rates, which have gone up from 6 to 10%, and what that's done to rental rates, etc., etc. So this pressure has been sort of going on for a long time. And we think actually there are probably sort of, you know, a number of different models or ways in which the high street will evolve itself. The first one is actually the use of the high street with stores as brand and product showcases. And this sort of plays back to the trend of brand owners will actually seek out to be retailers and really create product showcases and experiences for their brands. Leisure and service formats, and actually stores as multi-channel hubs and where the future of that lies. So we think those are certainly three themes that are worth you know, looking out for. In terms of stores as brand and product store, you know, showcases, I think there's enough evidence that whether you look at Apple or Lego, what a number of the fashion retailers and luxury players are doing in terms of really creating experience and bringing back a reason to come into the store. And we think that brand and product showcase is actually going to be a pretty fundamental role for physical stores in the future, which will absolutely coexist with online. Leisure services, and I think this data is actually really quite, you know, in the 1980s, 1990s, you had leisure was roughly around 20% of household expenditure. As we look at it today, it's nearer 50%. And that big shift, and you see that already clearly in a number of leisure formats that have rolled out. But we think, you know, this trend, you know, they've been in expansion mode, and there's more to play out in this. We think also there will be a number of new life forms that will emerge on the high street, and, you know, B2C services, dental practices, doctors, and, you know, a lot of players that historically sort of haven't quite been on the high street, but rental economics will now sort of probably, you know, ensure, and some sort of consolidation in those sectors means that actually you could expect to see them on the high street. The bookmakers haven't been doing too badly, gyms coming onto the high street, and actually things like art classes, life coaching, etc. So we think that the high street actually has the ability to support a whole load of new life forms. And the rise of multi-channel hubs as well. And it's quite interesting to see, you know, a number of retailers are seeing, you know, the majority of their online orders now going through click and collect. I think there will be a lot of experimentation around what the right model is, but, you know, certainly I think this is another sort of watch the space. So really, what does that all mean? You know, clearly a lot of changes, and I don't think anybody has the right answers in terms of this is exactly what 2020 is going to look like. But we can certainly sort of construct some scenarios, and what our, you know, best logical response would be under those scenarios. But I think, again, taking a capability-based lens in terms of, you know, what does winning in Retail 2020 look like? And we think actually this opens up, you know, some quite big sort of questions, opportunities and challenges for retailers in terms of how they reshape their capabilities to operate in this world. And we think there's sort of definitely a, you know, how you think about the customer, not the channel. So still a number of retailers are still organized by channel, whereas some of, you know, a lot of the evidence would suggest that customers aren't really thinking about it as channels. They're thinking about, you know, interacting with a retailer as a brand, regardless of whether it's on or offline, whether they're browsing or comparing prices and so on. So there's a whole lot of capability sort of changes that are required, but we think the most fundamental one for retailers to grasp will be how you sort of combine, you know, look at the world from the lens of the customer rather than from channel silos.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Anita.